thank you all very much for coming tonight. My name is Mario Platt. I'm CISO at Broadlight, as Joel was just saying. So I've been working in security for about 20 years. I got interested in penetration testing when I was 13 years old, back in 1997, and I've been doing and learning about security every single day since. So I've had roles in security engineering and operations for more than 10 years. I started as a penetration tester, as I mentioned, and since about 2014 that I've been focusing more on governance, risk, and compliance, but I still do all of the technical stuff. So I wanted to make sure that I didn't lose my engineering abilities, so I still, on a very regular basis, jump into systems, get CI/CD working, do code reviews with developers and all of that. So I like to keep all of those working together. What we're going to talk about today is there's a lot of information out there on DevSecOps about the tooling, right? Most of what you find out there is how to optimize tools, how to get better feedback from tools. Here we're going to talk about everything but the tools with regards to the CAMS model. So you may all be familiar with the CAMS model. It was developed by John Willis a long time ago, I think shortly after the 2010s, as one way to talk about what DevOps should be in terms of the culture, automation, measurement, and sharing. That's one lens to which to look at DevOps. So on the cultural aspect of it, we're going to go through each of them in detail, but it's largely about how people interact with each other, right? What are the patterns that emerge? How do people collaborate together? Measurement, as the name implies, usually it's about measuring things, the things we care about, so that we know and we can support management with knowing what should we be doing next, right? We take measurements because we want to make better management decisions. The issue of measurements, though, is that we tend to focus way too much on technical type of metrics. Right? And one of the things that we're going to talk about today is how measurements can actually be much more enabling tool if you try and connect different time spans. Right? So what happens for decision making at the executive level, all the way up to what happens to a knowledge worker that is planning for the next sprint. Right? And having an effective way of trying to connect these different time spans becomes one approach that we'll talk about here today. And finally, on sharing. So sharing from a couple of different perspectives. So it's not only sharing of capabilities, it's sharing of information and also sharing of concerns, right? How we deal with people in the organization. And we're going to go through all of that in a bit more detail and more context. So on developing culture, you may be familiar with Dr. Nicole Fosgren's book, Accelerate. It's completely changed how people approach software development, generally speaking, and what we think about proxy measures on how good of a development organization we have. So in that book, Dr. Nicole Fosgren relies on a well-known developmental model by Dr. Edgar Schein in terms of what is culture made of. Right? So there are other theories that were developed in the meantime, but Dr. Schein's approach still is in my opinion at least, is the more approachable, the more practical, right? I can actually do something with this because a big part of the problem in many organizations is that when you start talking about culture, it very quickly becomes very esoteric and it becomes complicated to try and understand what people are actually trying to get out of it. So I think this model is good because it gives us a kind of a way through. So in terms of developing culture, Dr. Schein argues that there are these three big buckets, let's say. So in order to enact changes in culture, you need to consider these three things. Right? One of them is around the assumptions. So how are people making assumptions? And we're going to go through details on all of the three in the next few slides. What are the values, right? Not just the values of what people talk about, but when people make decisions, what values are they enacting, right? Because that's what sets up recurring patterns that we end up calling culture. Right? And finally, artifacts, which is the part that I hopefully want to, if you don't get anything out of the other ones, please pay more attention to the artifact bit, because I think that's one of the most important and one of the most neglected in terms of trying to understand what it means to you operationally, right? When people log into your laptops at 9 a.m. and start doing their work, it's the one that makes most difference in enabling other things to happen as a result. So in terms of assumptions, there are three big things that usually affect the assumptions that people make. Right? So one of them is path dependence. Right? So it's one of the nature of complex systems that they are dependent on their path. Right? So what I mean by that from a security point of view is if you work at an organization that only had a security person that was really a compliance person, right? That all they did was call you into the annual awareness programs, they send you a couple of policy documents every year, and then when there's an incident, you see them on the meeting because they're capturing some things to do for the review, right? That generates a type of assumptions about what security is, right? If it's the first place where you're working as a professional, you are going to assume that's what security does, right? They write policies, they send stuff for others to do, and that's the work, right? And that leads to its own type of problems. But understanding the path dependence of the organization is absolutely critical in terms of trying to understand what it is that I can do to try and change it. Right? So giving a very specific example, if we come from a background, an organizational background where security are really gatekeepers, there are things that I will need to do if I want to improve the performance of my security team that I wouldn't have to do if that team had been approachable from day one. Right? And that's not something that I can sell you a model and say, look, you do these 5 steps and you're going to fix it. Right? That's contextual. Right? The organization is unique in that regard. Right? It's what happened to it and how you all, as part of working in teams, can collaborate with each other to try and do something about it. The other part is around affordances, right? How people work and make decisions. So affordances in biology is a term that basically means what is available to the individual. Right? There are some strategies that may not be available to us because I don't have the conditions, the prerequisites for that strategy to be available to me. Right? And that's one of the things that we, in security transformation, is often forgotten even by security leaders, which is what amount of change or what type of change can my organization successfully absorb, right? With having to do everything else that needs to pay people salaries, right? People need to keep on producing, they need to keep on doing other things that are making everyone happy. What is the security affordance in the organization, right? How can I start? And not having a good answer to that to begin the program can usually lead you to blind spots or you setting expectations then are not going to play out because the affordances aren't there, right? You don't have the things in place to actually enable you to pursue that type of initiative. And finally, on agency and trust, right? And for me, I think this is the big one. So I've been consulting for 5 years now, I think, something along those lines. So I've been working prior to that, I worked in everything from kind of startups to companies with more than 10,000 people. And this is a theme that comes over and over again, which is the issue of agency and trust, which I'll talk about in a model soon as well. But when we take agency from engineers, from developers, from what it is that they work on, they will typically have less ownership of it. Right? If I'm telling you that you need to do this at this time, that way, you don't feel like you own it. It's just something that you need to do, right? That's something that when we start thinking about how to integrate security into organizations, the issue of agency becomes really important. Because if you only have, for instance, a security team that is more based on looking at risk or looking at compliance, what gets to you over the line is you need to do X, Y, and Z because that relates to my risk treatment plan that I've decided elsewhere, that I didn't contact you to ask if you had any thoughts on how to solve that problem, but I'm now telling you this is how you solve it. Right? When we take that agency away from the people that are doing the doing, there's a certain set of dynamics that play out. Right? And on the other side, it reflects from a gatekeeper point of view, right? So the people that their job is a control function, right? HR, finance, service management, infosec, right? Those are control functions. We are trying to constrain operations to ensure that it can keep on being successful, right? At least in theory, that's what we're trying to achieve. In practice, we often add constraints to the environment that may make errors more likely even, right? But that's another set of problems. But in terms of trust is how much do the gatekeepers trust that if they're not looking over the shoulder of the engineer, that the job will be securely done, right? Can they trust people? Can they trust process to give them the outcomes that they're looking for, Right? And so this battle or this kind of tension between agency and trust by these two parties usually plays a lot on the organizational assumptions, right? So who does security around here, right? It's going to be very, very affected by agency and trust of the people doing the doing and the people doing the checking. The other area is on values, right? I love this quote by Patty McCord. She used to be the talent officer at Netflix, and I'm going to read it because I think it's important. The actual company values, as opposed to the nice-sounding values, are shown by who gets rewarded, promoted, or let go, right? So it's all very well and good to have all the vision and mission statements saying all of these good things, rainbows and sunshines, right? But when something happens in the organization, when there's a space for someone to be promoted, what were the behaviors that were rewarded, right? And understanding how that type of dynamic plays in the organization, right? So the organizations that are continuously reinforced by the incentive structures in the organization, then you start getting a glimpse at the culture, right? Because that's going to affect how people make decisions, how people think about their own career within the organization, their own path, and everything that happens around them. Right? So from a security point of view, thinking about what happened after the last few incidents, right? Were people let go? Did we just bring out the disciplinary process? Did we just say, actually, we've got a process for that, they didn't follow process, so now, well, too bad, it's their problem, not mine. I've done my management work of writing a policy or a process, right? Unfortunately, I've seen that a lot in my career. But when those types of decisions are made, they generate organizational dynamics in how people deal with each other and how they deal with certain themes, right? I've worked with an organization that as soon as someone mentioned that a particular tool had generated an alert, that people would stop and just worry about that and they would do nothing more. It wasn't an operational reason. It was because the exec got really mad the last time that someone didn't do something about it. Right? That may be what you're after, but that may be more problematic than it actually brings good to the organization. Right? So understanding how these values then enact certain behaviors in decision making is important. And from a security point of view, if we establish mechanisms to try and reinforce, either through language or direct mapping to business objectives, it's usually a much easier way to do security than it is if we're trying to justify all of the security initiatives in and by themselves. Right? Because that puts us in security, puts us in position of competing for resources. Right? Which is, you will maybe not be able to do that thing you wanted to do because I'm going to need those resources to do this security thing instead, right? And that is obviously a type of tension. I really like how Phil Venables, the CISO at Google Cloud, where he talks about how to think about this. And I really like the expression he came up with. So he calls it on slipstreaming business change, right? So really thinking about what is the business change that we're about to embark on. Things from a security point of view, it's not my budget, right? It's whatever those other people, they're the smart ones on a business point of view. I know how to do security stuff. They know their thing, right? They're going to tell me what their important thing is. And then my job is then to understand how can I slipstream my security program into the things that they're doing, right? So, and that usually gives us a different chance of approaching the problem, right? Or at least a different perspective on how to start thinking about it. Because for anyone who's been working in tech for a while, I'm sure you've all heard this story before, but a problem that we still have in security overall, from an engineering point of view, is that we're still thinking about add-ons, right? About bolt-ons. Right? So if you talk to an engineer who's building a boat, right, he's going to tell you, look, you can have more bunk, but it's going to affect your drag. You can have more this, but it's going to affect that. Right? Security tends not to play in the trade-off space. Right? We tell you, you tell us what your solution is, and we're going to give you the list of the things you need to buy to make you secure. Right? Unfortunately, largely speaking, that's where we are from a design point of view. And that kind of comes here, right? In terms of how we are thinking about our program, how we can integrate our security concerns into what the companies want to do, right? Becomes a differentiator on how we approach and how we consider values in decision making. And also at the team level, right? So there's always a difference between company level values and team level values. And if we're trying to do change at team level with things that exist outside of their scope, we're probably going to be less successful as a result of that strategy. But then we've got artifacts, and artifacts is something that I'm really passionate about from the point of view of optimization. Right? So Shook, which is another researcher in this space, has said, what my experience taught me was that the way to change culture is not to first change how people think, but instead start changing how people behave, what they do. Right? I'm going to give you a very specific example, also from a security point of view. I often find that a big part of the problem is the lack of usability of outputs from some teams to the other ones. Okay? Giving you a very specific example. If I'm a security professional and all I can do is give you a Word document that says you need to comply with these 4 things, right? I'm not giving you anything that you can use directly in anything that you do, right, as an engineer. Right? If instead of just writing that, I add to my security team the ability to codify those policies as code so that you can use it within your process, right? If we're talking application security, right? I would have on my compliance team, for instance, someone that knows how to write Cypress tests, right? And you would write whatever test that we wanted, you would integrate it alongside your unit and integration testing, it would be seamless, right? Or if I have a big security function and I can actually get away with doing compliance as code and have my own engineering team manage the compliance as code, then that's it. I build the stuff, I put it on a code repo, and then I go and talk to everyone in the company to say, look guys, you can use this, right? I'm not asking you to build it, right? All you need to do is come here and use it. These things, we're building it for you. It's a capability we provide. Right? But because we take this approach, we don't really think how artifacts enable communication between teams. Right? But if we were to do this at a compliance team, we wouldn't need to potentially write requirements for that thing that we've got a direct test on CI/CD. There's a lot of other stuff that we wouldn't have to do if we thought about the artifact output of my compliance function being a different one, being more usable to the other processes down the value stream that depend on it. Right? So I think this is the power of artifacts that we sometimes don't really think about. It's more, I've done my bit, now it's someone else's job. But what is that artifact doing in terms of enabling communication? Right? Because it's going to be massively different views of the world, right, that a security person and an engineer has. They're both correct, they're both necessary. So we should think about artifacts as ways to bridge this communication gap and not as a way to replace it, right? Because that's not what it is. People communicate through artifacts, not just through boring meetings on Zoom. Yep. And the artifacts can do much more heavy lifting than generally we've been kind of thinking about them. So in terms of questions to ask is around these security capabilities, right? Do we have someone that is actually providing them, right? And are those artifacts easy to consume, right? If you use a particular type of testing suite and I give you a security tool in a completely different one because I thought that was good, now I'm forcing you to adopt a new tool so you can consume my output, right? That's not the place that I like to be. Thinking in artifacts is in a kind of jointed way, right? This is the constraint, so now we build around the constraint, not the other way around. And again, it's something that's in security we're not very good at doing. We're good at saying you should do this here, then, and there, not you tell me what to do, now let's think what are the problems around it and how we can fix them together, right? It's usually a different approach. The other part is, are artifacts required for security in the context of the work, right? Thinking of artifacts in terms of the context that we're trying to influence, again, is a way to differentiate between a successful and an unsuccessful tool, right? If I give you a security tool that every time you need to look at a security report, you need to log into a different portal, go to a different system, then maybe the naming convention didn't pick up the right field, you need to kind of figure out if X, Y, and Z means A, B, and C in terms of system names on another system, right? So I'm making all of that process much more complicated for you. I'm not allowing you to consume the information in the context where you are doing the actual work. Right? So thinking in terms of, if I'm going to give you a very specific example, false positive management. Right? There's a difference between me saying, look, you send an email, then a compliance person will get back to you. We do that every 2 weeks, so you need to wait, that type of stuff. Or I give you a capability, look, here's a security tool. You manage false positives as code. These are the files, this is how you use them. Use your tool. Right? It's different. It's the artifact doing a lot of the heavy lifting and governance on our behalf, not necessarily as putting people in the middle of the process to stop it and say, look, we've got a problem that we need to fix, right? So again, thinking artifacts in a more integrated way. It's all about the UX, yes, the developer experience, etc. Right now, and this is something that I've been in my talks that I usually try and say a lot, is the number one criteria for choosing security tools should be developer experience. Right? Everything else is, look, there are differences between quality of security tools. Obviously there are, right? But that's not usually the constraint. The constraint is usually on the social process that we've got inside organizations or the organizational dynamics around decision making. Usually that's where the constraints are, not the technology. So spending millions of pounds on technology and paying lip service to practices doesn't make logical sense in my head, but that's where we are, generally speaking. The other part is around enabling traceability. Again, making artifacts carry the communication we want to have. Right? For instance, if a security person is concerned about your identity and access management authentication in AWS, okay, let's say, the compliance person, they don't really understand AWS IAM. Maybe they don't need to. What they do know is that their compliance standard, ISO 27001, has something called Annex Controls that has a chapter 9 that talks about access control, right? For that person, in that context of risk and compliance, to know what it means, all they need is that mapping. Then they'll situate, okay, this relates to my access control requirements. Okay? Now, if we have artifacts that are usable in the engineering process and are tagged with the traceability required for the gatekeepers to make sense of what it means to them in their context of doing risk management, of doing compliance, again, the artifact is making the heavy lifting for you. I don't need to bring someone in the room and ask you 5 questions that you're going to tell me the answer and for me to say, oh, that's what he meant then, right? The artifacts can enable that communication, right? And again, this is about work system design. It's not anything else, really. And as I'm sure you've probably seen, in security, we really don't think about products, generally speaking, as in terms of maintaining a capability that others can use, etc. We think about projects. We buy a multi-million-dollar license of something, we deploy a box, we enable the communications, and that's it, right? We don't really think about, this is a product that I need to nurture, I need to get user feedback, I need to understand if my users, if the engineers internally, both platform and software engineers, are they using my capabilities and are they happy with using them, right? That's a question that is not usually asked, but it's the question that where all of this culture stuff, right? If we think from an artifact, enabling communication, making people more effective and approachable, that's where I think a lot of the magic that could happen is not happening right now, and that's a space that I'd like to see more explored in most organizations that I work with. So we're not going to go through in a lot of detail on this model, but I'm just going to show it. So this is a model that I've created that I've called it the DevOps security model, archetype model. So on it, you've got at the top what I call the security unicorns, which I define very simply as the people who understand that speed and quality, right? They're not mutually exclusive, they're mutually reinforcing, right? You do things with quality because that enables you to go at speed, right? At the bottom left, we've got the gatekeepers. So usually people that have a very narrow understanding of quality, right? That can be InfoSec, HR, finance, service management. They're usually, it's quality. They're concerned about valid things, right? But it's a very narrow view of what the product, quality product is, right? And on the right side, that we'll see on the next slide, we've got the rainbow makers, which are the engineers making the magic happen. So here, what I really think what I try to do when I work with clients is really understanding where they are, right? So if the governance people really think that a pen test and code review, so what's preferable, is what they think good security looks like, I have absolutely no business in talking to them about chaos engineering. They're not ready for that. It's not part of what's even fathomable in their heads, right? It doesn't help them, it doesn't help me, it doesn't help anyone, right? So understanding where each of the clients are in terms of the functions that they have internally gives you what can I do with the world view of that stakeholder right now, right? the way they see the world, or what's preferable, etc. What can I work with? And if we start thinking about what they think is absolutely required, we can think what's plausible. Maybe threat modeling, policy as code. We could show a few examples on cookies, right? Let's explain how we can do policy as code to enable uniform cookie enforcement around the organization. Simple use case, you can prove the value. And then we can start thinking about other stuff, right? So understanding where they are in terms of that journey of changing culture is really key to success. The same thing on rainbow makers, right? If I come to you and I say, look, right now there's a new risk management process that takes 3 hours to do every time and we need to do it every 2 weeks. People are going to tell me to go away and think again, right? Or if they don't, they should, right? Because that doesn't make sense. So thinking in terms of what are things right now that people feel they have the agency and the ownership to do, right? You manage your Jenkins systems, I'm going to help you make your Jenkins system secure, right? Something that you already have ownership of, you see yourself as the expert on, and I'm not saying you need to redesign your software to do all of these security things you haven't done, is you know your stuff, you know you are accountable and see yourself as owning that system. How can I help you make that system more secure with the tools that you have right now? Right? In sorting these conversations usually leads to other stuff, process assurance, what you already do, processes, etc. Baseline tooling, make a couple of, what I usually do is I create a GitHub page called something like security testing. I document 4 or 5 security tools with TLDR. You just copy paste, and this is a Docker command that you do, and you get a security report, right? And that becomes, these are all the artifacts that make it easy for people to consume security, right? And as soon as things become easy, I usually find myself 3 months down the line, people using stuff that I've built, and I don't even know that they did. It's them telling me, look, I actually saw your thing that you did over there, and I started using it. Right? But again, the artifacts are enabling the communication, are enabling the sharing, are enabling all of that. And then up to a point where they can own all of their security, etc. Right? And then that's something that we can think of. Let's work within what their knowledge is, how comfortable they feel that they can do security, or that they know what security is, and then we take it from there. Now, on measurements is the usual Goddard's law that I'm sure everyone knows, but this is the main thing. So there was a sociologist called Elliot Jaques that developed this concept of time span of discretion. Right? So time span of discretion, in the most simplest terms, answers the question, how long does my manager allow me to produce outputs before they come and check on the outcomes? Right. So whatever you are, whether you're a knowledge worker working on 2-week sprints, or you're an exec working on 3-year cycles, it's exactly the same. It's the same question, right? How long will your manager, who's up above you, allow you to produce outputs before checking your outcomes? Right? And this is something that we sometimes lose track in security. We focus too much on how many vulnerabilities we have, or that type of stuff that really doesn't connect these time spans very well, right? At the top, you've got some flimsy idea of what risk is, but then from then on, it becomes a bit more less scientific or less useful. So this is a way that I like to try and connect these 3 timelines. There are other ways of doing it. This is one that I particularly like because it's simple. So thinking of business risk from a normal business attribute normalization perspective, so something like trusted, reputable, those are things that I usually, when I interview an executive, they will tell me those words, right? And what I like to do is I pick up those words and I use it against them. And I think it's the best approach to do with anyone. This is free advice, please take it. Using their own words against them is the best strategy to make someone change something. So having this idea of the things that they care about, and then trying to make some kind of traceability through my enterprise architecture, through my processes and activities, on how we connect those different time spans together. Right? So at the top, we want to be trusted and reputable. The VP or director, we are going to need to negotiate some kind of measures on how we're going to see what's a key risk here, right? When does it become a problem, right? If we are not doing this security thing. And that's something that needs to be negotiated. And then that can help inform what you actually do on your agile sprints, right? So when you go to look for threats, for mitigations, and making sure that you create the validations, it's the validations that do the magic, right? I don't care how many mitigations you create. If you don't also create a mechanism to validate that those mitigations are still applicable, we are not allowing organizations to move at speed, because the next change might break your mitigation and you won't know about it. Right? So the job only gets done when you've actually written the validation that's going to give you this continuous validation that things are going well. And then the process part on how you connect these things together. So at the top, you can have some kind of risk analysis, which can be as simple as Mozilla's rapid risk assessment, which is a 30-minute type of methodology that helps you define risk at the product level, as opposed to kind of go deep into stuff. So you can use some kind of lightweight risk management process where some of those gatekeepers get involved that can then inform what the engineering stories should be looking at, that will then trigger a threat modeling session that will look specifically at that threat that you've identified, right? And that becomes your risk treatment plan, right? So you didn't create something completely separate on a register just to do that. You kind of created this with process. You've got something that tells the management intent of the things that are concerns, that informs something in engineering, that creates you a threat modeling, that you create in the mitigation, that becomes your risk treatment plan. Which can lead to something like this that I've built for a medical company about two or 3 years ago, which was a kind of a product dashboard of other stuff that they cared about. So I helped them gather what those metrics were, the key risk indicators, etc. And then all of this compliance stuff, where we agreed on definitions for each of those. So those are not just kind of words, right? They have specific definitions. They've got targets against them. And that's what's leading the kind of red, green, blue that you see there. And that helps at the product level to give a really good visualization of are we good, right? Or are we doing the things that we care about? And again, this is another one that from a social dynamics point of view, I think it's a missed opportunity for most security teams. Because what I usually like to do is all of that engineering and product risk is stuff that is on the head of product managers. I dig it out and I put it all on the same field, right? What I usually like to call it is I call it leveling the playing field. And I call it that because I go into teams' backlogs and I can see everything that affects their performance, everything that affects their availability. It's all bugs, they're there. But I don't see security stuff. Usually security is not part of all that thing that people grab and have a look at product level. So usually the way I frame this back is, look, I just want to level the playing field. I just want my security stuff to be visible in however you report your product performance. And then if you work on it or not, that's your problem, right? At that point, it's visible to yourself and your management. And I'm not here to make decisions. I'm just a security guy, right? I'm just here to try and surface things that need to be cared about. The minimum metrics that you should think of from a DevSecOps point of view is really the DORA metrics, right? And security can either be, that's my opinion, many people may disagree. But if the way we're doing security is hurting what is considered the 4 key DevOps metrics, then security is not being supportive to those, right? And security can either be supportive or not. So lead time, right? Every time we do manual reviews and wait for people, that's going to increase the lead time. If I don't have an integrated process of these kind of high-level risk assessments that go straight into sprint planning, then I'm decreasing this metric for the delivery organization. Same thing with release frequency. If I'm having to do manual security scans, etc., we won't be able to release as often because you're going to have to wait on someone else to actually deploy the code, right? That hurts that metric. Change fail rate. So failing builds on security findings increases the change fail rate, right? So we should be very, very careful when we set a tool directly in CI/CD to blocking, right? There are very, very few tools that I move into blocking mode if I'm not at least a year or 6 months to a year kind of using it. The only exception, I think, is Chekhov, the infrastructure as code, because those are really high fidelity, generally speaking. But every other tool that I tend to use, it's usually between 6 months to a year where everyone feels comfortable, okay, we can probably put this in blocking right now and because we know what we need to do if something happens. And then time to restore service, right? So doing game days and all those types of things, convoluted and tested incident management processes, they may increase that time to restore service. So my view is that if we're going to be supporting DevOps with security, first and foremost, we need to look at the things that are important for them, right? And see how we can play a role in supporting the betterment of those metrics, not think about our own ways of doing things. So making them relevant within agency, contextualizing the metrics. So just saying that everyone in your company, if you've got 10 development teams, just saying everyone in the company needs to be above 15% in terms of, or below 15% in terms of critical whatever. Right? That blank statement across the organization is probably not going to work. Right? There are some teams that probably have been working together for a month, others have been working together for 5 or 6 years. They're going to be different, the maturity of the code bases they deal with. One was probably a project started 10 years ago, the other one started 3 weeks ago, and it's a completely new stack, right? Trying to apply a blank approach across all of your development teams is not going to make sense. Some teams will feel that it's going to be 3 years before they've got anything to show for it. Other teams will already be there and say, there's nothing for me to do here. Right? So that negotiation on a per team basis and involving product owners is what actually drives security to be considered, right? As part of that. And never establishing target metrics without understanding what current looks like. And this is a big problem in our industry, where we just look at ISO 27001 and we say this should look like this, but the world doesn't work like that, usually. And now just to finish, some ideas on sharing. So I like to think of sharing in 3 different ways. So this is more sharing of concerns, but I also like to think in terms of sharing of capability and in sharing of sharing of concerns, sharing of capability, and sharing of information, generally speaking. So sharing of concerns is about being psychologically safe to bring things up, right? So a recent example, about 3 weeks ago or something, a Volkswagen employee was supposedly let go because they did some security stuff that apparently shouldn't have happened, whatever. So the problem with that is it generates a type of organizational dynamic that you don't want, right? If people feel like they've made a mistake and then they've been sacked, obviously, there's a line on gross negligence and intent, and malicious intent, right? A line will always exist. But that not existing, which doesn't seem to have been the case in this situation, dealing it directly as disciplinary in putting people, telling people off and actually getting them fired is going to have much more negative effect in your company culture than anything else that you could have done on that event, right? So thinking about how we can make that safe for people to come through and actually act on whatever feedback we get becomes really important. And actually a precondition to good security culture, right? You don't have a good security culture if people don't feel safe in bringing a security problem and trying to deal with it. Battery is running low, but should be okay. Then it's about sharing of capability, right? It's not just about writing documentation, right? Especially where people won't see it, right? That issue of context switching that I was mentioning previously. So writing as close to client context as possible, right? If we're going to have to change culture in how people think about security, if engineering teams are using Confluence to write security, to write their how-tos and guides, that's where security should be writing them. If they're doing it in Git, that's where I should be writing them, right? Security, generally speaking, if we're trying to affect how normal work is done, we should be thinking in terms of the context of the person doing the work, right? And trying to, as much as possible, to avoid having them have to change that context. The other part is creating short videos, right? So an example that I've actually done with a client just last week, right? So we set up, I'm helping a crypto company build a product security function. One of the things that I did was we put on a meeting on everyone's calendar for an hour and a half. I spoke through how to use 5 or 6 open source security tools and the kind of important flags to use or how to use them, etc. At the end of the session, I broke up the video in kind of 7-8 minute segments. It was posted on their Confluence, and I've seen about 7 or 8 people already saw that. There was a lot of the team already on the call. So basically what I'm trying to say is try and making a way of async, in an async way to make it easy to consume information and make the information as small as possible and close to context so that people can actually use it, right? Not convoluted 30 page processes that no one will ever read. Yeah, and not just sending links to documentation, having a TLDR version, right? So what I usually do with that is someone asks me, that happened about a month ago. They had a new repository with Terraform code, right? And they were asking me, so can you help me do a security audit on that? And instead of just doing it for them, I went to my GitHub page that I already created with a copy paste of the Docker command. I put it there, look, this is the command, we can pair if you want, right? As opposed to, yeah, here's all this link, and on chapter 4, you've got the 5 commands that you actually need to use, right? It's a completely different approach. And finally, sharing of information, right? So communities of practice in particular are very effective mechanisms for 2 reasons. The first one is they're usually voluntary, so you get people that have some interest already. You're not forcing people to be in the room. And the other aspect on community of practice is I like to think of it as what I call the distributed sensor network, right? I like to, yep. So community of practice is an agile term that it's become famous even before that with the Spotify model. The idea is that you've got a community that gathers around a particular type of subject, right? So a QA community, a security community, along those lines. They're not functionally related. It's just a bunch of people that gather on a weekly, monthly basis, whatever, to talk about the particular theme. And they talk about how is security working for everyone, right? So that's why I think it's really, really useful for security, because it becomes my distributed sensor network, right? If people tell me this thing, because they feel they're talking to each other, I can actually get the real feedback of what people think, not me as the CISO, calling an engineer into the room and asking them questions, right? That's not going to work. I'm never going to get value out of that type of approach. Yes?
Such as we are working in Volkswagen and they are doing this hack, and we are the DevOps guy that's supposed to deploy the software in 10 years in a row. What's your responsibility in this one? Because this is a planned operation and they are hacking this software, and you need to deploy this software on an ongoing basis, even upgrade the software.
Yep. So that's the organizational part of all of that, right? Security, there are 2 aspects to security, right? That sometimes we don't treat them as separate. There's the issue of design, right? Am I going to design a secure system? And then there's the issue of operation, right? The issue of operation is a really complicated one because it's not just about security. The main problems aren't even the security ones. It's the functional ones. Oops. That was the last slide anyway, so don't worry. Yeah, but that's why the operational aspects become much more important, because drift will happen, right? Not only that, but systems evolve for a bunch of time. You will have 2 or 3 people that understand a lot of it, but no one will have the full system in their head. That's just not how things work. So yeah, that's a problem, but it's not a problem that we solve with design, right? That's more in terms of operations and how things develop from there.
But is the DevOps guy responsible because he's deploying this for 10 years in a row?
Yep.
Should he or she know what is going on, what he is deploying, and what he is causing on? He's burning all these trees.
Yep. So that will depend on the organization. Right? There will always be depending on the organization. I don't think they should, right? But again, that's my own personal view. That will in each organization will be different. What I can say is that that's the blame apportion that usually comes with when things go wrong, right? I have never seen, and I read a lot about this stuff in safety science and resilience engineering. I don't think there's ever been a single case where blaming the person has actually helped with anything. And it usually makes it worse because people then don't come forward with whatever issues exist. So from my point of view, management, I think, would be better served as thinking of most issues as work system problems, that it's a design and management issue to go and solve, then there's a bad apple and we need to deal with the bad apples when we figure out they're bad, right? But it's a fundamentally different approach, right? Most organizations, unfortunately, aren't there. And that was it. Yeah? Questions?
I like the idea of you saying the security team should be product focused, not project focused. I like that. So I was wondering, do you have any suggestions to a security team who's maybe thinking a lot about CVEs?
Mm-hmm.
You know, they're in the news a lot, they get a lot of attention, but how do you maybe integrate CV scanning in the right way? And because as an engineer, you can see a CV as like critical. Okay, but how do you get that information of how to fix it,
Yep.
and what to do, and what the engineering team should do from the security team in a way that's not a big horrible manual process?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. So CV is a big problem in the organization overall. So I think CV is bad, CVSS is worse. So I see a lot of, is everyone familiar with CVSS? It's basically a scoring mechanism, right? That you say it can go from 0 to 10. 10 is really bad, 0 is you shouldn't care, right? Kind of in a nutshell, that's what it is. But the thing about CV is that you never get the information that you need to understand what it means in your operation, in my opinion. Right? It's very easy to know that there's a particular function that has a vulnerability, but are you even using that function in your code? Right? You may be using the library, but not actually be exposed to the issue. Right? So having effective tooling, that is actually on CV management where I kind of create an exception and say you actually need really good tools to help you do that. Everything else, my philosophy is right people, right process, any reasonable technology. If you're having to, for management of CVEs, you really need good technology because there's no way to, or you're going to be inundated with so many kind of thousands of warnings that it becomes, what do I do with this? I either spend all my time dealing with CVEs or I do my job, right? And I can't choose the former, so I need to do the latter, right? And you will often find yourself in that situation. But what I usually say is trying to find what is the least overhead that you can have on trying to assess criticality. Right? And then there's one of two options. It's either something that the engineer team is trusted to know how to make good judgments, right? That the security team can help on getting the capability so that it's visible to you what the problems are, and then train you in a way where you can make your own decisions, right? That's one option that is not usually used. Or you can have the other option, which is we still do all of those things, but instead of letting you deal with that yourself, we expect that every time there's a vulnerability over over 7, that you need to come to us. And that now we've broken a value chain. Now we've put ourselves in that value chain, and if it starts getting hit too much, we're going to have a negative impact on the business. Right? But those are kind of the two philosophies, right? That you can have to deal with that. I always prefer the one that is more integrated.
Which tool are you thinking about when you say you're really good?
Snake. From my experience, they are kind of really different from that point of view. They let you kind of focus on what's really important and not all of the other stuff. That if you're just using, for instance, if you're using NPM for package management, you can do an NPM audit and get all of their output. It's not useful because it doesn't tell you any useful information, right? Sneak, it's not. It actually does a bit more and sees, is this actually exploitable? How would it be exploited in terms of your architecture? So it gives you a bit more information. Any other questions, comments?
So have you ever looked or heard of like SBOM technology?
What, sorry?
The SBOM kind of stuff.
Oh, SBOM, yes.
Yeah. So
Yep. Cyclone DX is usually the standard that I've...
Yeah, is that going to be something which could make your jobs easier to leverage because it
Oh,
gives
most
you
certainly.
kind of relative open confidence?
Yep. It not only, it has the benefits that usually a lot of people don't consider as well, which is license management, right? There's a lot of big assumptions in the development community overall that it's just open source, you can just use it. But the details on what actual license you have may actually impede the intellectual property of your company. Right? So I think that that's also one of the reasons why the industry is moving to SBOM type of approaches, because I think in the next, now with all of the supply chain hacks and all of that stuff that has been going on in the last 6 months, I'm pretty sure that in the next 2 years we're going to start having the obligation, at least for SaaS providers, to provide the software bill of materials of the software composition. I think we're very close from having some actual regulatory action on that type of stuff. So might as well do it now, right? It's not that hard, right? It's just an XML output that says, these are the things that I use, this is how deep the structure goes, and these are the licenses type thing. It's not anything particularly scary.
Cool. Well,
Thank you all very much.